Hello everybody, my name is Ray. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Today we're going to be talking about Brian Houston. He is gone at Hillsong Church. And we're going to be asking, is this the end of Hillsong Church? And that's a pretty important question. Hillsong Church is one of the largest churches in the world in terms of its many franchises worldwide and globally. They're basically a denomination. That's how large this church is. So if without its head honcho, that head honcho being Brian Houston, what is their roster going to be like? And can that roster sustain the organization? That's the question we're going to be answering. And I'm going to give my thoughts on that in a second. But first, let's cover the context for why we are in the situation we are in. So Brian Houston is brought up on criminal charges in Australia for his involvement in concealing possible. And by possible, I'm not talking about the sexual abuse, but him possibly, allegedly, concealing child sex abuse criminally. So that is why Brian Houston is resigning his post at Hillsong Church. That is why. It's not out of his own choice. He's not choosing to retire. He is not being Rick Warren after coming out as a woke egalitarian, deciding, I'm going to retire from the church. That is not what Brian Houston of Hillsong is doing. Quite the opposite. He is resigning pretty much with the cloud of disgrace over his head because he is under criminal charges. Now, the criminal charges, are they, how solid are these charges? That is a question. Brian Houston has vowed his innocence. He believes he will come away pretty clean with more scrutiny of the situation. He's pretty confident in that, or at least that's his posture. But again, Josh Duggar also had that posture. But I do believe the difference is Brian Houston does have a pretty solid legal team from what I gather. He's hiring some pros here. These aren't the Trump election lawyers, if you know what I'm saying. And it's a little bit dubious as to whether he broke Australian law. So we got to separate two things. There's man's law, and then there's God's righteous standard. And I personally believe that Brian Houston violated God's standard on this issue. His father was a pedophile, a homosexual pedophile, and he does appear to have had some knowledge of the situation, and it's very likely that he did not handle the situation biblically. However, it is also likely that the investigation, the criminal proceedings against Brian Houston are motivated by animus against Hillsong, because Hillsong is, and I know a lot of people aren't going to like this, but for all intents and purposes, Hillsong is a characterization of evangelicalism in Australia. It's not the complete picture, but stereotypically speaking, that's what Australians think of when they think of evangelicalism. That's unfortunate, but it's true. And for that reason, they could be going after Brian Houston, not necessarily the merit of the charges against him. So that's pretty important to point out. We got to be fair to Brian Houston, even though I am on the record writing that Brian Houston is a false teacher. However, how many secular governments know the difference? And I would say not many. So they don't really care if he's a false teacher or not. They're going after him because of what he represents. That's the point that is very possible about this situation. Not necessarily the merit of the charges, but because of who Brian Houston is and what he represents. So with that saying, can Hillsong survive without Brian Houston? If we look at Mars Hill is an example of a church that did not survive when their lead pastor, Mark Driscoll, was ousted. They did not survive after that. This was one of the fastest growing churches in the United States. They collapsed basically overnight because they lost Mark Driscoll. The entire church model was built on the Moses model, and their Moses was ousted in disgrace. Is Hillsong in the same boat? There's reasons to believe that they are, and there's reasons to believe that they're not. Hillsong has a pretty weak bench when it comes to their roster. Brian Houston's at the top of the lineup. But if you look at their prominent leaders underneath them, a lot of them have faced disgrace, especially overseas. And by overseas, I mean not in Australia. Carl Lentz was basically the second most famous person in Hillsong worldwide, probably. He was basically the face of Hillsong in the United States. But Carl Lentz fell hard because he was cheating on his wife with some Instagram whores. So that's who Carl Lentz was, and there was clear disputes between Brian Houston and Carl Lentz. They didn't seem to like each other. So that's also indicative that Brian Houston kind of had an alpha male mentality, but in a bad way, like a Mark Driscoll. So a lot of the people underneath him probably might have been pretty weak in temperament and not able to challenge Brian Houston. Can those people run the Hillsong enterprise? This is a huge enterprise we are talking about. It's not just many church franchises, it's also a music record label. And, one of the largest contemporary Christian music artists in contemporary Christian music. So this is a really big story. It has really big implications. And I think it's very possible that we are seeing the end of Hillsong. I think that's very possible. Now, what are the odds on this? I think the odds are somewhere around 30 to 40%. If I wanted to give just an educated guess, I think the odds are 30 to 40% Hillsong could collapse or implode as a result of Brian Houston being gone. But it does seem like Brian Houston, because he has gradually stepped back. Now he's out completely. So he has gradually stepped back up until this point. Now he's out completely. It does seem like he has groomed his replacement. His wife also seems to be staying on board. So it's not like him and his family are completely gone. No more tentacles in the situation at all. But does the replacement for Brian Houston have the capability of running this enterprise? That is the question. And I think 30 to 40% chance he does not. And this church collapses. Maybe not overnight, but steadily, especially as the scandals keep piling up. Because in the United States, Hillsong Church has undergone so many scandals, financial impropriety, a bunch of people basically racking up huge credit card bills because they know this is other people's money and they're spending it like other people's money. And then you got Carl Lentz, who I've already talked about. So Hillsong, very shady. And again, I've already written that Brian Houston is a false teacher, and I stand by that. And I do want justice to be done in Australia. So if he's actually guilty, then I want him convicted. If he's actually innocent, I don't want to see him convicted. So that's really all I got to say about that. Again, not a huge story yet, but could have huge implications. So that's all I got to say about that. My name is Ray. Let me know what you think about what I think in the comment section below, and I will catch you on the next one.